Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers, de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau. Now, we've talked about Poutinefest, Maine on the podcast before, which was a great event. And at this event, Mike and I had the fortune to be set up next to a tent that really seemed to be getting a lot of attention. So I obviously took a look and saw that it was an author selling a book called The Long Walk Home with the Ceinture Fléchée, the Arrow Sash. So picked up a copy, and the book has been getting terrific reviews, and I'm very excited to be joined today by the author of that book, Paula Grandpre Wood. Paula, welcome to the French Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here, and good to see you again.
Yeah, so before we get talking about the book, can I get a little bit about your story? Kind of where are you from originally?
That's part of the book, you see.
Exactly.
I was born in 1957 in Central Pawtucket, Rhode Island, Central Falls, Rhode Island, 35 years after my great-grandparents had immigrated from Saint-Liboire, Quebec. Family had been there for 35 years. My great-grandparents lost the farm that they had in Saint-Liboire, which forced them to have to make the decision to immigrate. And of course, like many other French Canadians, they had relatives living in the Central Falls, Rhode Island area.
Sure.
A lot of textile mills, and that's what set them up for coming down there. I lived there until I was 12 or 13 years old, and I really didn't realize, the depth of it until I started getting into writing this book, like my great-grandparents had been there. We lived there until we moved to Northborough, Mass. When I was 13, Massachusetts. And that's where most of my family still lives. My husband and I, at some point in time, we've been in Barre, Massachusetts, which is North Central Mass,
Okay.
for the last 22 years. And during that course of time, I've been a physical therapist for 35 years until I recently retired. In 2019, I kept a small private practice open where I saw private clients for about 4 more years, and I officially retired last November. So it's been about a year.
Awesome.
And my specialty was osteopathic manual therapy. So it was very hands-on, and I got to know many people for many, many years. So
I
it was
bet.
a really family practice,
That's awesome.
which I love.
Now, you talked about kind of your family's history. Now, how present was the French identity kind of in your life when you were a kid? Did you grow up around people speaking French?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. It wasn't spoken in my home because my mom didn't speak French, but my dad did with all of his cousins, his mother, his sisters. I went to a French Catholic school, St. Matthew, in Central Falls, Rhode Island. So that was my life. I
Sure.
didn't know that's who I was at the time. My meme, just my meme and my tante, and just, but regretting not learning or keeping the French. Even though I went to a French Catholic school, I wasn't very good at it. And it wasn't spoken in my house, so it didn't get carried over with me.
Yeah, that's kind of my story too. My sister and I are the first generation that didn't speak it in the house.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I think that pretty common for a lot of us. It's funny the way you describe that, because my sister, I remember one time she was asked about what it was like growing up in a Franco-American house, and she's like, I don't know what it's like to grow up in any other type of house.
Yeah.
That was just like her. I don't know. It's the only thing I do.
I was a kid. That was our life. And, that's who we were. I went to the French Catholic school. We had our Irish neighbors who went to the Holy Trinity Catholic school.
There you go.
They went to a totally different school, different church, but, we were all in one neighborhood. Many of my neighbors spoke French.
Yeah.
Whole family would be speaking French, and it's funny because my mom, she's also French Canadian on her mother's side.
Okay.
But she never knew her dad, so we're not quite sure who her dad's ethnicity is. They came down in the 1800s, her grandparents, so, she's from French Canadian descent also.
What made you want to write a book?
It's funny, I never thought in my whole life that I would. I really didn't even like writing very much,
That's
but
funny.
my ancestors, they kept calling me in that sash. We called it the sash. My meme introduced it to me as the sash. I had no idea until I started my journey in about 2012, and then discovering what it was, that it was a Ceinture Fléchée. So once the spark got lit, I couldn't stop finding out about who was the first grandfather that owned this very old sash that had got passed down through my Des Grandpre family. That's all that my memory could tell me was it was very old. It's been in the Des Grandpre family for many generations, and it was worn by the men in the wintertime, wrapped around their bearskin coats, their winter coats.
Yeah, can you maybe just give for those of you maybe not super familiar with what a Ceinture Fléchée is, if because I know for a lot of us the that's probably like one of the first things you think about if you're a Franco-American. You start thinking about what, the traditional clothing that our ancestors would have worn. One of the
Yeah.
first things that comes to mind is the Ceinture Fléchée, but I know a lot of people would still not be super familiar with it because you don't see it around anymore. So could you just kind of describe what it is, what purpose it served?
Once my aunt, my tante Lucille, finally remembered and wrote down that it was called a Ceinture Fléchée, I had my clue, and I could go online and find out what a Ceinture Fléchée was. So originally it was a finger woven sash. The history of it is really interesting because they really don't know the origin. So the arrow sash design has been found in Israel, Japan, Scandinavia, and in Canada. The origin of that, then I got to learn that it was a big part of the fur trade industry. So as the fur trade industry went west, so did the sash or the Ceinture Fléchée. And it was so popular and in so much demand that they couldn't keep up with the supply, that they had to, in 1850, start to make them on looms instead of them being finger woven because the
Sure.
demand was so high in the business. And it was through finding that, her writing down that name for me, that I was able to trace it and find a woman who authenticated. So the sash was used, and it was, if you read the history of the early French Canadians, settlers in Canada, in Quebec, I guess, they would have a big coat on and they'd have this sash tied around. There weren't buttons, so it would help keep the coat closed. I'd also read that it could be used kind of also as like a back support
Oh,
also,
really?
because you could tie it tight and it could support. But when you look at the writings and the first people visiting in Quebec and whatnot, they would describe and draw pictures of the men in these big coats with the sash tied around their waist. I had that clue. It was like I became obsessed. I couldn't stop looking into more and more about the sash, but who was the first grandfather? And I had been gifted the genealogical work, so it made it easy once I had the name.
For those again who may have seen, because we're coming to carnival in winter carnival
Right.
in February, the snowman, dancing snowman guy, he's got the censure.
Oh no. Oh my God,
Yes.
if I say it correctly. Well, yeah, because it is the symbol of the French Canadian people. They also wore it kind of as a symbol against the rebellion against the British after, the British came and took over.
Yeah.
And it's also the symbol of the Métis people, from what I've been told.
Awesome. Now, so you've got, I mean, obviously the books is going to trace the story of this one very specific
Yes.
item that's come through your family. When did you first see it, and when did you first really start to get the impression or the sense, like the understanding that this is something super important?
Well, when I first saw it, as I was putting everything together, I was interviewing my meme in her apartment in Pawtucket, Rhode Island when I was 19 years old. I
Yeah.
was doing a woman's study course about women working in the industrial industry. She took me in her spare room and she showed me the sash, and I thought, this is great. But it was kind of weird because it was always passed, through the men. The oldest
Mm,
son would inherit it, she told me. But I knew from the moment I saw it, I'm like, well, why can't it be mine? I
that's
would like
awesome.
to have that sash. And the attachment began then, and I knew of it for years. And maybe about 11 years later, I was gifted the genealogical work going back to 1658 by my aunt again. She had all this information. I had them both for years, and it wasn't until 2012. And I tell this story when I give the presentation on the book sometimes. I have a friend who does beautiful acupuncture work, and it's the ancient form of acupuncture called five element acupuncture. What I love about it is it has these wonderful spiritual names attached to the
Cool.
points. And that day I had a sore right shoulder blade. she did her magic on that point, and I always asked her the name, and she said, "Well, that's called your heavenly ancestor point." And I said, "Well, isn't that nice?
That's
Right
funny.
by my wing bone." I went off, and like I tell the story, it wasn't that day, that week, or that month, but after that, I became obsessed with the genealogical work and the sash. And that's when I started my first trip up to Quebec. I had been to Toronto years earlier when I was in high school, but this was my first real trip to Quebec with the genealogical work. And I had a friend who lived in Burlington, Vermont, so she had set the whole thing up for us. And we went to Trois-Rivières and we started hitting the different places where they first lived. And I couldn't stop after that. I came back and I had more information, more questions, and it just kept going and going and going on to a second trip up to Quebec. So the specific areas that I wanted to visit, of course, were Trois-Rivières, Champlain, the Cap de Madeleine. Champlain is right on the St. Lawrence River, and my 8-time great grandfather, Charles, came in as an indentured servant.
Oh,
And after 3 years of servitude, he was granted land grants,
mhm.
one in the Cap de Madeleine and one in Champlain. So I just wanted to I still didn't know how old this sash was. I still didn't know who the first grandfather was. I just wondered who it could be, and maybe how did the tradition start, passing it from, a father to the oldest son, and then it just kept going. So we touch base there, and then there's this great little island called the Ile de Pas in the St. Lawrence River, where after Champlain, 6 of his 12 children end up moving to this little island, including my 7-time great grandfather Alexis, and they were there for 142 years. So then trips to the Ile de Pas. But of course, the place that I had the most written information about was the farm in Saint Lebois, because in the book, I include the 3 memoirs. Again, my ma tante Lucille had 3 memoirs of her aunt, my great aunts, and they tell the life on the farm from 1917 to 1922, and how they lost the farm. And I include a version of each one of their stories because they're seen through different eyes, through different lenses of the ages they were, and just what the life was on it. I'll even start crying just talking about it, because
Yeah,
every time I reread them, I can be there with them. I can feel them, and what it was like to be on that farm in Quebec during Christmas time.
sure.
It going in the spring, they write it by seasons and what happened. Just loving being there with them, and especially how they talk about my great grandfather and how I fell in love with my great grandfather, who I never met, through their writings. It's
It,
really special.
it is funny because I remember I was doing an interview once for somebody up in Quebec, and I was talking about my first time up there. The way you described it's awesome because for me it was almost like I knew it wasn't where I was from. I knew it wasn't like my home, but I also didn't feel like a complete stranger either.
Yeah,
It was just
exactly.
there's something that in the back of your mind that says, I think I kind of belong here. And it's really neat. No, I love that. Now you mentioned, of course, you talked about going up to Trois-Rivières, and I was hoping we get into that town a little bit because it's cool you give kind of background of some of these towns
Yeah.
in the book, because we've talked about the early history a bit on this podcast, or a little bit on this podcast, a few episodes. Talk a lot about Quebec City. We talk a lot about Montreal. We
Mhm.
always acknowledge that there were three and that the third one was Trois-Rivières, but that's basically the amount we talk we talk about it when compared to the other two. So maybe talk about what Trois-Rivières was about and maybe what it would have looked like when your family was there.
Well, they came in 1658. They were Huguenots in La Rochelle, and I started the
Yes,
book in La Rochelle. And so, I'm like, La Rochelle, what is La Rochelle, when I'm first looking up the history? And then they were Huguenots? What is a Huguenot? And then just getting into the whole Reformation, the religious wars, what happened to the Protestants in France during that time? And as I write in the book, my ancestors must have saw the writing on the wall. We got to get out of here.
sure.
And so in 1658, La Rochelle became the port where many settlers left from to go to Quebec. Trois-Rivières was the second settlement. First, it was Quebec City, then Trois-Rivières. And I think it was established in like 1635. And they went there in 1658. I think at that time there was probably about 450 some odd
Wow.
settlers. So they were really some of the first settlers there.
Sure.
And they were indentured servants to the governor of the time of Trois-Rivières. I forget his name at this time, but
Sure.
it's in the book.
Yeah, exactly.
But so just finding that out and finding out, it's a big decision because you're going to get on a boat for 3 months
Yeah.
and hope that you survive the journey. You had to be leaving something, something really pushing you out of where you were. Because La Rochelle is a beautiful port city. When I look at the pictures now, I'm like, why would they ever want to leave
Mhm.
there? And their ancestors had been there for, hundreds of years. So
Sure.
what would drive you out of there? But to come to Canada at the time, or New France, it was called, you had to convert to Catholicism. So they even had to leave their faith. So it had to be a lot that pushed them out there. And my 9-time great grandfather, Charles's father, had to sign the papers for him and his wife, the contracts,
Mhm.
for them to be able to leave. And so, just imagine what it would have been like for them to make those decisions to leave their dying father behind and journey to this wild and crazy new settlement where but first of all, hoping you just survive the journey, which my grandmother did not, but her three
Oh,
children
wow.
did. Yeah,
Yeah.
the three children did, and they made it. They had many descendants. And the
Yeah.
name at the time was Dutot.
Very
So from
cool.
La Rochelle, it was Dutot, but it was common during like the 1700s that there could be name changes. And Des Grand Prix was, I'm almost going to say, gifted to them for favors and alliances to the Boucher family. And in France, there's a town called Grand Prix, and I think it's like
Mhm.
under the House of Luxembourg. So you had the Lords of Grand Prix. So somewhere along the line, 1722, the Alexis Dutot becomes Alexis Dutot des Grand Prix. I'll ramble on and on about
No, no, that's awesome.
it.
I think I thought going back to La Rochelle is particularly cool because I knew very little about it. What I did know for the most part was because I'm a giant rugby fan and they have an awesome rugby team. There's a terrific rugby team, one of the best, probably one of the top three in Europe right now. Yeah, it's funny. It's like, but this
Someday I hope to visit.
because, like you said, though, I looked into it because I follow the team. I'm like, where is this place? The pictures are
Right.
absolutely gorgeous,
Yeah.
right on the water. And you're right. I think Champlain himself left from La
Oh, did he
Rochelle.
really?
I believe
I didn't
so.
know that.
Yeah. So I mean, that is very, very cool that you were able to get into that. And like you talked about, they left for a reason. And
Right.
and that's probably something I don't spend a lot of time thinking of. For me, a lot of time the story begins like when I tell my family story, it's always like, oh yeah, the first Martineau who came to Quebec was in, and my story starts when he's in Quebec. I don't
Hmm.
know anything that's before that. And I think that's very cool that you have that place and you can start to, especially with that time period in which they left, that you can start to put together what may have been going into that decision, especially as Huguenots.
The history of La Rochelle, more and more fascinating. It was, the siege of La Rochelle in 1627. If anybody's read The Three Musketeers, they talk about Cardinal Richelieu and the siege of La Rochelle. And that was the last stronghold of the Huguenots. They had been displaced from the rest of France. And it was the last stronghold, and then they finally lost in 1627, and power shifted in La Rochelle. And by I think 1681, you could not be Protestant in France. You had to walk out by that point or be killed. And so that's where it's funny because I tell the story every time I'm on a train going to New York City and we go through New Rochelle.
Yeah,
Those
yeah.
were those were, some of the exiles from France who started the new settlement of New Rochelle in New York.
Very cool. Now, I wanted to go to another town that you mentioned before. You talked about Cap de la Madeleine,
Oh, I
and
love the
and,
Cap de
and I
Madeleine.
want to talk about specifically because when you talk about in the book, you mentioned a priest named Father Desolate in that
Yeah.
town, and I think that's awesome because I have a bunch of Desolates on my family
Oh,
tree.
really?
So I thought when I saw the name, I'm like, that is very cool. In fact,
Miracle of the Bridge.
they're buried right here in Manchester. In fact,
Oh, that is so neat.
yeah, so a bunch of them, they like, in fact, when my dad was a kid, he would be sent up during some of the summers to spend some time like on the farm with the family that was still in Quebec. And that was the Desolates, the family he
Oh,
stayed with.
really?
Yeah. So tell me about Captain Medellin and how did you find out about Father Desolate? Because that's not just something you see on a born died like genealogy
I
tree.
went to the Cap de Madeleine, so I picked up literature up there. I picked up a pamphlet that
Yeah.
told the whole story about father and the miracle of the bridge and how they got all the stones over there to build the little chapel and how he just kept praying for them to be able to get this through and really brought the faith back to that area. It's still to this day you have periods where people abandoned the church, and it was happening during that time. I think it was in 1876, the miracle of the bridge. I might have that date incorrect, but I just found it fascinating. But I like miracles, so I like reading about
Yeah. Do you
miracles.
explain
And
what the miracle of the bridge is?
they needed a new church because people were coming back. He had prayed, they had been praying the rosary. Usually the river freezes that they can cross in the wintertime, and they had all of this stone that they had to pick up to get over to start this church. And the river wasn't freezing. It wasn't freezing. And they kept praying because they had to get this started. It froze. They prayed to the Blessed Mother, and it froze just enough that they sent all of these sleighs over there to pick up the stones to bring them over. But it was pretty precarious. But they went back and forth, and they got every single stone over to build the new church. And to this day, now at this site, there's a basilica, and it's the national shrine to the Blessed Mother in the Cap de Madeleine, which has been incorporated now into Trois-Rivières. It used to be a town of its own. But my Charles was granted land in the Cap de Madeleine. So I went, and that's how I started finding out the story of the Cap de Madeleine. And just like, wow, that's where he met his wife to be. There was a fort there. Her father was the captain of the fort. And then from there, they ended up settling in a little town just up the river, St. Lawrence River in Champlain, which is just a beautiful, they called him a cultivator. So he cultivated wheat and hay and just the story. But yeah, the Cap de Madeleine is a very special spot. I've been back there once again since then.
No, that's
I like to
very
go
cool.
visit. I like to visit the shrines of the Blessed Mother.
Which I can certainly understand. And what occurs, obviously you had a lot of this research provided for you. You got a big boost, but there was still,
Genealogical work, yeah,
yes, exactly. But
which is
there's still
huge.
there's still a lot that goes into putting together a full story like this. And someone who's done a lot of genealogy, that takes a skill. You have to be good at it. How much
I,
of that did you
I
have
always
going
just
in?
loved history.
Yeah,
I always just loved history. And like I said, once it started, I became obsessed with it. And even for me to be on a computer is very unusual. But
yeah,
like, right, my husband would come in the house and it's like, you're still sitting there on a computer, on the laptop. I just found the history, and knowing that that's where my ancestors had been,
sure,
so fascinating. I couldn't stop. So I just would keep reading and looking and reading and looking and just saying, what was their life like?
sure.
And the woman who helped me put it all together, Marjorie Turner Holman, she became my book shepherd. She said, Paula, I had so many questions. She said, you're writing letters to your ancestors, address them as such. And that's when I began addressing, dear, great grandmother Jean, what was it like in La Rochelle during the siege of La Rochelle? And I just had so many questions. I couldn't stop asking questions
Yeah, and
that they became letters. And then in that, researching what was La Rochelle, what happened during that time. Wow, there was a lot going on. And, there were like 2 million people that were killed during that civil war, the war of the religion in
sure.
France.
Yeah,
So I've always loved history, so it was easy.
that's awesome. And for those, if you pick up the book, you'll see there are quite literally letters. There,
I
you are
know.
actually writing letters
I know.
throughout it, which I think is a really cool way, especially provides some transitions in certain places, which I thought was really neat. Now, so
Well,
I would do want to touch on one other thing, 'cause we like telling the Acadian story here when we can.
oh,
So how does that? You're gonna have to let us
oh.
know how that fits. I know it's not the happiest of tales.
I went up to Nova Scotia in 2008 because how could I not go to Grand Prix, Nova Scotia? You
Yeah,
know, Even though I knew that through the genealogical work, we had the Grand Prix had no connection with Grand Prix, Nova Scotia through the distant cousin who did the work. We were up in Cape Breton, and my husband and I, Mike and I, were going to spend time in Grand Prix. And I went into the National Historic Site of the Acadians. I don't know if you've ever been to Grand Prix
I
yet.
have not.
Oh, you should go
I know
sometime.
it's on
And
the bucket list for sure. Yeah.
I had read Evangeline, so I had
Yes.
heard the story of what
Sure.
happened in Grand Prix. I had heard all that, and it touched me so much. But going to that historic site and dedicated to the Acadians, you walk in, and there's just these plaques of the names of the families that were exiled, deported, the grand derangement,
Yeah.
that they were everything was taken from them. And just looking at the story and looking at the names, and there is no Grand Prix name on the plaques, but these plaques are under a statue of Our Lady of the Assumption because they tell the story in there that she is the patron saint of the Acadians. And they tell a whole story that at a certain point she walked 800 to 1,000 of them back when they were freed from the colonies from Boston. They walked back, trying to get back to their land when some of them found out it had been taken. Some stayed in the New Brunswick area, some made it back and resettled in different locations in Acadia. But just knowing the whole story, being there, seeing names on the plaques of kids that I went to school with at
Sure.
St. Matthew's, I'm
Yeah.
like, I know I felt that I was Acadian, but I knew through the genealogical work, supposedly I wasn't, but I did see a name Dupuis, Dupuis, and it rang a bell to my meme on her side of her line. So it wasn't until I was sitting writing the book, and then I wrote about my travels there and
Sure.
just talking about going there and feeling the pain of what happened to the Acadians. I went to bed that night, and it was like when I kind of became obsessed with finding out about the sash and who the first grandfather was. I woke up and I was obsessed with who were these Dupuis? What was my meme's lineage? Sure enough, I sat there and I went back. You can get all these different ancestral sites that you can access. And I just sat down for the day and
That's
just
awesome.
went and plugged her name in, which gave me, her mother, her it just went down
Yeah.
to 1757, born in exile, one of her
Yeah.
great grandfathers in Massachusetts, born in exile in Massachusetts. And that's when I knew, okay, I'm so close. And of
Sure.
course, his father was born, Francois Dupuis, in Grand Prix, Nova Scotia, Acadia,
Sure.
and that they were his actually two grandfathers, his father Germain and Germain's 7 sons were held captive in that church while they were rounding up the women and children and bringing them, bringing the ships in
Yep.
to deport them. I talk about, generational wounds. When I uncovered that information, and I knew for sure that was my ancestors that had been held in that church, that their land had been taken, everything had been taken from them. I just wept. I wept for a whole day. It's funny, it told more of my story and my work, which I told you earlier, is a whole body work with the last 22 years of my life. It's based on the osteopathic manual therapy. So you really have old wounds that can be stored in your body emotionally or not just physically. And that day I wept for them, but I wept for me, as I found out what they went through and scanned like what my ancestors went through in La Rochelle and just how deeply it touched me. So you can see, they just kept calling me deeper
Yeah.
and deeper into who they were and who I am and how I ended up being where I'm at, but what they had to go through to get
Sure.
me there.
Yeah, no, it's funny because we had a couple of guests on the podcast, one of whom was like an expert in Akkadian genealogy, and he just kind of asked me, we're just talking before the interview, and he asked me about some of the names in my family tree, and I told him, and he's like, last name Richard. He's like, that's an Akkadian name, and I'm like, well, I'm sure. I had no idea, and I
Uh-huh.
and I knew this story, but within like 4 hours or something. He gave me a call and he gave me the
Ooh,
name. He gave me the
ooh,
exact name of the
really?
ancestors who were expelled as part
Yeah.
of this. And you're right, the impact that changes from knowing the story to being able to identify a person who was in
Yes.
your family tree who was there
Yeah.
is substantial for sure.
Yeah. It was incredible. And, from now they're in it, it's not funny, when I say to people, nobody knows the story of the Acadians. I was told I was even I went to an Acadian social club over here in Gardner. Hope they're not watching. And I just said, whoa, do you celebrate, the national holiday that August 15th, that the Acadians celebrate? And they're like, no. I'm like, what do you mean, no? And I'm like, do you tell the story? And really, they don't tell the story. And he goes, everybody
Wow.
knows the story of the Irish. I'm like, yeah, they know the story of the Irish, what the British did to the Irish. Do they know what the British, what happened to the Acadians? But so many people just don't even know that part of the history. So again, as part of my obsession, I tell the story.
Which is awesome. No, which is why I'm glad I wanted to make sure to talk about it here. So you have all of these stories that you were able to collect. At what point did you say, you know what? I want to turn this into a book that I want to tell the entire world about kind of my family.
After the second trip to Quebec, we went to Newport, Vermont. My grandfather, my Pepe, tried to get back to Quebec as close as he could. And they had a farm on the Derby line until he had an accident. They had to move back to Pawtucket. So we went up in that area, but we went to Newport, Vermont because my aunts talk about in the memoir how they came through the border. They talk about the ride. They talk about being detained in Newport. Went to Newport and we stayed in a bed and breakfast just outside of Newport. And somebody asked me, and of course I had the sash with me. I brought it all to all of my trips in Quebec. Found their graves, tied it around their graves, and I had the sash with me. And this woman was asking me, "Well, what are you doing up here in Newport, Vermont area?" And I told her, she goes, "You should write a book." I'm like, "Oh." And I'm like, "Well, I'm not a writer, but I'll find someone who can write it for me." And I really thought one of my really good friends, I thought she could do it for me. But in the end, she discovered, she said, "Paula, it's not my story. You have
Yeah.
to do this." And I just started sitting down and I just started writing. And then I couldn't stop writing. And then with Marjorie's help and then Pamela Johnson, who was the editor, they cleaned it up a lot for me so it could be, put together as a book. But I told the story. There was no stopping. It's
Yeah.
funny, like I say with the sash, the Ceinture Fléchée, it keeps walking me onward to different connections with different family. When I think it's over, it's not over, and a new connection is made. And I learn more about my ancestors than I knew before. And it just became, I couldn't stop. That's all I can say. I just had
No.
to tell their story, whatever it became. I just had to tell their story.
Obviously, we're telling this story that's all inspired by this sash. To your knowledge, who was the first person to have that sash? Who's the first person whose hands you could put that sash in?
I was very fortunate that I found France Hervieux. I hope I'm saying her name right. She is the artisan and specialist of the Ceinture Fléchées. She has brought back the art of finger weaving up in Quebec, and she was able to tell me the history. Once she told me that it was an authentic L'Assomption, which is a town on the St. Lawrence River, not far from that little island where my ancestors lived for 142 years. She said it was a L'Assomption Ceinture Fléchée. It was made in 1850 when they became standardized on the looms when they had to keep up with the fur trade industry
Sure.
and how much they were in demand. And with that, and she told me that it was unique because of the way it was designed, the design of it, how it was laid out was unique, and that it was just a treasure for the family and for the Canadian history. And so when she said 1850, it was easy. Now I know it's 174 years old. I go to the genealogical work, and there on the little island of the Ile de Pas, one of the Searle Islands at the end of the Lake St. Pierre, I think it's called, my three-time great-grandfather, Vitel II, would have been the first grandfather, and his wife, Christine Silvestre, And they lived on that island till about 1865. So it was on the island for about 15 years. Now, of course, I'm assuming some of
Well,
this,
of course, yes. But
but
it's pretty
that's
safe
my
assumptions, I
story
guess.
that
Yeah, yeah.
he then moved with the sash down the Damascus River to the St. Simon area, St. Simon, St. Lebois. That's how they came down to that area. In 1865, there was, again, you've got all these things that happened in that time, which sent a lot of French Canadians even down to the mills after 1865, I've been told. But there was a great flood and it destroyed many homes on the Ile de Pas, and many lives were lost. And it's about that time I see them gravitate to St. Simon. And that's where I found his grave in St. Simon. They've always got that big stone Catholic church with the graveyard next door. And that's where
Sure.
Vitel II and Christine's graves were. And I could bring them the sash and
That's
tie it
amazing.
around their gravestone. I could bring it into their churches. And then in St. Lebois, is the second owner. He would have passed it to his son, Vitel III, who was my two-time great-grandfather. And then in 1916 to my great grandfather Domina and his wife Albina, and they were both Des Grand Prix. They were first cousins, so I've got a lot of Des Grand Prix from
Yep,
both sides.
for
But
sure.
from there, when they lost the farm, they decided to auction off most of their stuff. They were fortunate they could auction the farm. Many farmers at the time, inhabitants, were walking away and just leaving it and trying to
Yeah.
get work down in the States. So they packed only a few things, figuring they'd buy furniture and whatnot when they got there. And one of the things that my great grandmother kept was the sash.
Of
And that's how
course.
it made its way to Central Falls, Rhode Island, and eventually to my Pepe, then to my father. Now it's my brothers. But I call all of the memes and myself the keepers of the sash because they're the ones who kept it safe. They're the ones who brought it from place to place. And even my aunt said, "Oh, yeah, the men never took care of it. It was men." So that's the story of the sash and whose hands it went through. And even my great aunts talked about, holding it in their hands. So if I bring it to their graves, it was a part of their life. And now it's part of mine. And I
That's
tell a
awesome.
story.
One more question, because this has been very, very fun. And it's just a cool story. I want to tell you basically the impact of this process. Because as I was going through this, I know I tell people all the time, I spent 6 months in Quebec City, and
Yeah,
I still say it was the best 6 months of my life. And
yeah.
I think in a lot of ways it changed my life. I
Mm.
cannot imagine that you could go through a process like you did to put this book together and not have it have an enormous impact on yourself. So I would just like to kind of have you talk about kind of what this entire journey kind of has meant for you.
I have to just stop for a minute because I guess it's meant so much. Again, I might almost cry
Yeah.
because as I tell in the story, I think a lot of us don't realize how close our ancestors are still to us, even though they've passed. And I was told a story a long time ago by a client, a patient of mine, and she said, and she made many trips to Korea, and she said that they had national holidays honoring their ancestors, and they believe that their ancestors walked with them from 4 generations plus 5 generations back. And that's what I felt like what was happening with me on my journey. They were leading me on. I always thought I was taking them somewhere and bringing them together. And in the end, I found that they were really praying for me all along, for me, bringing me back to my faith, the Catholic Church. I had been away from it for 35 years. And all of a sudden, I'm returning to some place I thought I'd never go back to. It brought me to realizing, when I thought it was over and writing the book, that I'm Franco-American. I never knew I was Franco-American till I went up to the Rassemblement
Yeah,
and where I met Mike. And I'm like, I'm Franco-American. I always just thought myself French Canadian. I've heard that story a couple of times of people discovering it later in their life. It was just our life. This was
sure.
who I was as a kid. And then when I think week that's over, I go to the Museum of Work and Culture in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, to give a talk down there, and Beatrice is telling me the theme of the museum is La Survivance, what they needed to bring with them to survive away from, Quebec, I would say, and what forced them to leave during the time. And just hearing them say, it was their faith, it was their language, and it was their tradition and culture. So I really feel like, they've brought me back to my faith. They're walking me deeper into my Franco-American culture, who I am, what our people, my ancestors were all about, the community they have. The only thing I don't have is the language.
Yeah.
But you
never
never
too late.
know.
Never
I'm
too
getting
late.
a little spark on that too. And I just met a man here in town from Cameroon who speaks French.
There you
And I
go.
said, you never know. You might, I might have to ask you to be my tutor. So who knows? But they keep
Exactly.
walking me deeper into who they were, but who I am. And it's really special. It's just really special to learn and to experience it and to share the story. And as you can tell, I can just keep talking and talking and talking about it once
I
they get
love
started.
it. Well, this has been an awesome conversation. We have been speaking with Paula Grandpre Wood, the author of The Long Walk Home with the Ceinture Fléchée, The Arrow Sash. It's a terrific story. It makes for a terrific book. We will link where you can get the book in all of our social media, as well as the notes for this particular podcast. Paula, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you too. This has been a lot of fun.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never dies, our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.